Well, and sadly, I meet a lot of young women who really get tied up on this whole merit
Mm,
argument. I don't want to get the job because, or I don't want to get this opportunity just because I'm a woman. And it's like, please wake up and smell the coffee because, your male colleagues have been getting these sort of opportunities since birth. You just haven't been kind of clicking onto that.
mm.
Just because you've got this one opportunity and you think it's associated with your gender, like, would that hold your male colleague back? Not in a second. Why do we even
No.
have to ask ourselves these questions?
Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for emerging, experienced, and executive leaders to build community, grow capability, and future focus their career pathways. There has been a global shift in how we lead, and our conversations with leaders and executives explores the skills, strategies, and mindsets that is needed to thrive in this ever-evolving landscape of the future. So whether you are a seasoned executive, an aspiring leader, or simply curious about the future of leadership, we are here to give you practical insights to unlock your potential, change the status quo, and break open our assumptions on how work works. Produced in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives, Future Fit Leadership is your place for bite-sized learning for executives hungry to make a change. Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. Dr Sue Keay is one of Australia's leading thinkers in robotics, AI ethics, and the future of work, though her story starts at a very unexpected place. She began her career as a geologist, happily focused on rocks until life and a very persuasive sister nudged her into robotics, and thank goodness she listened. What I loved about Sue is how she reframes Australia's place in this space. We often talk like we are behind, but she reminds us that we were the first country to automate our ports and that the navigation technology used in those giant autonomous mining trucks was created right here. We innovate brilliantly, but we risk losing talent offshore if we don't create an environment that keeps them here. Sue also brings such a human lens to AI. Australians adopt new technology quickly in their personal lives, yet our workplaces hesitate. And that creates one of the biggest leadership challenges ahead. Some employees will sprint towards AI, others will cling to what they know, and leaders will be holding both realities at once. She also says something that rings very true. People fear technology when they haven't had the chance to experience it. Put a robot beside someone, and most of the fear may just melt away. We also talk about ethics, accountability, and who actually gets to shape the systems that will affect every part of our lives. Sue is clear that leaders must build AI literacy now. Digital literacy was one step. This is step two, and we cannot afford to fall behind. And of course, she is a fierce advocate for women in STEM. She shares honest and sometimes painful stories about structural barriers, the messages we give our children, and why representation matters more than ever in male-dominated fields. Her insights are sharp, funny, and incredibly human. This conversation travels across climate, health, education, remote robotics, and the mindset leaders will need to navigate a future that is arriving very fast. Sue is smart, warm, brave, and unafraid to say what many of us are thinking. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Sue Keay. Sue, welcome to Future Fit Leadership. So nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks, Sadhna. Thanks for having me.
I'm really interested with this conversation, particularly around the robotics piece, but I do have to ask you, how did you end up in robotics? It's not
Oh,
a career path we see a lot of women go into. So how did you end up there?
well, I blame my sister. So she's been in robotics for quite a long time. She I guess was looking at some of the social aspects of robotics at the University of Technology in Sydney. She then moved over to the States, and she's currently the managing director of Silicon Valley Robotics, which is a group that was set up by early successful robotics companies in the US as a way of giving back and helping to encourage new robotics companies to develop in the space. So
Mm.
for many years, she's been telling the family that robotics is the way of the future, and she's, had a real inside view of how robotics has developed. And coincidentally, my background's actually as a geologist. So I was, on path to be a research scientist in that space. But then, life took a bit of a turn and I ended up moving more into sort of research management and commercialization. And an opportunity came up to help set up the Australian Centre for Robotic Vision, which that was a decade ago. And that was a first opportunity to try and bring robotics and computer vision together. And I rang my sister and asked her for her view because it was a new area for me that I
Mm.
was unfamiliar with. And she encouraged me to take it on board. So yes, it's been a very unusual career path, I guess. But I think everyone, we often talk about portfolio careers,
Yeah.
but then people seem surprised when people have one.
Well, it's the way of the future, though, isn't it? I mean, there's a few of us who are doing it already, but portfolio careers are certainly the way of the future.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be more common in the future that, someone who starts off, in rocks like I did might end up in robots.
Talking about robots, I'm interested to know your thoughts on where you see Australia compared to the rest of the world.
Yeah, Australia has always had a great reputation in something we called field robotics.
Mm.
So that's about the big, robots that you might see on mine sites or, out in open areas. A lot of people aren't aware that Australia was the first country in the world to automate our ports. So if you
Right.
fly into Sydney and just look across, at the port, or if you fly into Brisbane and look across at the port, you'll see these, large, what we call automated straddle carriers. That means that no people are working on the dock. These straddle carriers will go around, they'll pick up containers and move them around. That doesn't mean there are no people working there. They're just in a control center, keeping an eye on
Mm.
what's going on. And Australia was the first country in the world to look to automate its mine sites. So those big yellow autonomous haulage vehicles that you see essentially are big robot trucks. And Australia developed all of the navigation technology that is in those. So although we don't actually build those robots on, in country,
Mm.
the technologies that go into them were all developed here. And so, yeah, I think we have quite a strong heritage in the development of these very robust, reliable outdoor vehicles where, which are suited to the Australian conditions. So they often have to operate where there is no satellite coverage. They have to be very robust and reliable because they're often in remote areas. They have to be very energy efficient because
Mm.
you might not be able to access batteries or ways to power the machines. And yes, they have to often work in communication denied environments, either underground or underwater. And so Australia's had to get very good at developing those technologies. And one of the reasons that, this has been a particular challenge in Australia is because we are a small population that inhabits a gigantic continent. And we literally have thousands of kilometres of infrastructure that has to be inspected and maintained. So,
Mm.
when you think about power lines, pipelines, roads, rail lines, power lines, all of these things require, us to keep them going. And we actually don't have enough people to do that. So
Mm.
that's really pushed the development of Australia's specialty in this particular form of robotics.
Mm. We've almost had no choice but to move in that direction.
Exactly.
Mm. You've said that Australia's planning for AI adoption has been inadequate. What concerns you most around this piece?
Well, I did mention that my sister's the managing director of Silicon Valley
You
Robotics,
did.
right? So unfortunately, what she sees, what I see is that there's a lot of talent and technology being developed in Australia. And what she sees is that talent and technology bypassing Australia's shores and just going straight to the US
Mm.
to set up and start business. So, I mean, there's a combination of factors of why that happens, but the main thing is just that it is far easier to access capital in the US
Mm.
and get access to those markets. And what I would like to see is, more investment so that that talent and those technologies can be developed here in Australia and that we will get the long-term benefits of that development rather than, I mean, I think it's great for people to go overseas and get experience, but I think it's a real shame if we're not investing enough to encourage people to set up those companies here in Australia.
Because it can become a real export product for us if we keep it onshore.
Yes, exactly. And,
Yeah.
at the moment, not just I think there's a lot of export potential, but also, we import a lot of these technologies that, ironically were developed here in the first place.
There's a lot of conversation at the moment about AI or robotics taking over jobs. And, I still believe there's a place for humans and they always will be. But what do you think some of the issues leaders are going to face in workplaces of the future, which is really not that far away, where we will have to reshape how we think and how we lead in an environment where maybe half my workforce is human and half my workforce is robotic?
I'm not quite sure why, but Australians in their personal lives are very quick to adopt new technology, and yet our companies are very conservative. On the other hand, we have Australia actually leads the world in fear of AI. Now, what I have always attributed that to is the fact that, in general, people don't really know what AI is and aren't exposed to it that commonly. But since the invention of ChatGPT, we can now have access to AI to experiment with on our phones. And in some respects, I think that's a good thing because it really gives people an insight into, what the potential opportunities, but also what the limitations are of this technology. Because, in particular, when you think of robots, most people wouldn't come across a robot very often. And so a lot of the perceptions about what a robot is are really colored by films, which aren't representative and don't really give people a good understanding of, again, what are the capabilities, but importantly, what are the limitations? So where is a human's place amongst that technology? You can't know that until you get that hands-on experience. But I think the big challenge for companies is that, it's almost like a two-speed situation where you are going to have people who are, and we see this in companies even now, where they've already adopted AI in their personal lives. They have it on their personal devices. They want to be able to use that at work. But then you'll have another group of employees who don't want to engage and who don't want to use the technology. And I think, and who would prefer to do things the way that they've always been done. And I think that that is probably going to be the biggest management challenge that we have. You're going to have, on the one hand, a group of people who are very keen to make sure that they have access to the latest technologies, and that's what's going to attract them to working with companies. And then you're going to have another set of employees who, are maybe not going to be favorably inclined to the opportunities to upskill. That's going to be very difficult to manage. In some respects, I think that's probably going to be the harder thing to manage than the technology adoption. Although, again, that is another big issue. There's so many failed AI projects. They take a long time frame. It's often really difficult to unpick the benefits, but it is, the direction that we're heading. And it also pushes companies to be far more experimental and take on more risk than I think most companies are comfortable with. Because to take advantage of many of these, you often can't, if you really want to get an advantage, you can't wait until it's an off-the-shelf product, because then everyone's got it, right? If you want to use it to competitive advantage, then you have to be prepared to take on the risk of investing in projects that may fail.
So you're also the chair of Robotics Australia and a leader in AI ethics. What are some of the biggest questions, particularly around the ethical piece, that we perhaps are not asking ourselves at the moment or need to be aware of?
Well, I think the big issue that we have is that I think Australia has taken a very measured approach to identifying risks and asking questions. I mean, we have an ethics framework. We have a whole bunch of toolkits to help businesses to develop responsible AI. That's a real focus of a lot of AI research in Australia. However, at the end of the day, because we have technology companies that are larger than that I guess earning more money than many countries' GDPs, we have a limited influence on what they do. We've already seen this with, the threat of tariffs against Australia on the basis of our social media regulations. So while we as a country might form a position of what we think is acceptable use of AI, that doesn't mean that that's the AI that's going to be served up to us. And that's another reason I think that we need to be more seriously considering the investment that we're making in this space so that we're not necessarily reliant on big tech companies to meet all of our AI needs.
And how do we embed ethical frameworks, or who does that? Because when something goes wrong, my first question is, well, who's responsible for that?
Yes, exactly. Well, I think, and that's the key. There always has to be someone who is responsible for the deployment of these systems, or else, there is no accountability. That's very important. And, I was fortunate to speak at a procurement event lately, and I did find that was fascinating to see how much thought is being put into actually looking at where AI models are developed and who's responsible for the development of those, where the data was collected from that those models were trained on. I think for larger companies, they're very seriously looking at the supply chain for AI products. And I think that's very important to make sure that that's understood so that, companies do fully understand the risks that they take on by adopting these technologies.
Now, in your role at CSIRO's Data 61, you focused on cyber physical systems. Can you explain to our listeners what that means in a practical sense? Because I read that and I went, what does that mean?
Yeah. Can I just say I inherited that title?
Right, you would have called it something different then.
Well, I mean, I really broadly see that more as robotics, but honestly, that would cause such a storm amongst researchers because everyone's very tribal and they, have their own very distinct ideas of what tribe that they fit into. So cyber physical is really about the melding of the digital and the physical world. So, well, not just digital and physical, but also biological. So it incorporated research into cybernetics. So, how you would develop biological sensors, for example, but also, how sensors are applied in the physical world. And really, cyber physical systems was a very broad term that encompassed robotics, computer vision, cybernetics, development of sensors and sensing systems. So really, it is just the confluence of physical, digital, and biological.
So, okay, this is probably going to sound like a really silly question, but so does that, when you talk about biological and sensors, does that mean that the AI or the robotic can actually then merge with the human body and allow us to perhaps have limb movement where we didn't have movement before, or see where we were blind, things like that? Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Yeah, bionic vision. Yeah, that
Yeah,
was one of
yeah.
the projects in my group. Also looking at how you could use sensors to detect after a traumatic brain injury how the brain was repairing itself because unfortunately after a traumatic brain injury many people develop epilepsy
Mm.
and you can try and mitigate that by giving the patient certain drugs, but those drugs can have bad side effects. So you don't want to give it to people unless they need it. And you can tell by the way the brain is repairing itself if you attach the right sensors whether someone is at risk of developing epilepsy and then administer the drug, okay? But you can't do that unless you're actually developing sensors that know how to extract those, that information from people's bodies. I mean, I guess you could just look at it as a slightly, more advanced form of what your Apple Watch already does, right? It's using its sensors to figure out, a lot of information about your health. There's just some ways that we can be very targeted about how we unmask that information and use it to try and improve patient outcomes.
It's interesting because we talk a lot about robots and AI replacing humans in the workplace, like in an office environment. But I'd love to know your thoughts on how much it will integrate in things like hospitals, or where we've had emergency situations. So, there's been a cyclone or roads have collapsed and, things like natural disasters, fires, etc. How do you see, in particular, I guess, robots in the future, or maybe not that far away, playing a role in things like that?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of Australian hospitals now are taking advantage of the Da Vinci surgical robots,
Hmm.
but the robot is never, it is always a human in the loop. There is always a surgeon there who is controlling the robot. But I think that, well, and also really the main use case for robots is always about putting them in situations where we don't necessarily want to have humans. So in a disaster zone, as you've said, it might be that roads are cut, people can't get to where they need to go. It's dangerous for people to enter that environment. In which
Earthquakes are
case,
really, sorry, earthquakes are the first, when you say earthquakes is a good example of that, right?
yes, in which case robots are exceptionally useful for developing situational awareness to be
Mm.
able to give information back so that we know when it's safe to send humans in. But it also can be very convenient. So, for example, if you've had your house damaged during a disaster, the roads are cut, you can't get people to come in, but you had the opportunity to have a drone fly in, take photos of all of the damage of your house, get that back to the insurance company. They can process your claim without anyone ever having stepped foot on your property. They can send you a check. They would already know what repairs need to be lined up for you when there is access back into your property. You can see there's a lot of advantages to being able to do that. Of course, there are going to be situations where robots could be built to do work that otherwise humans might do. But I'd have to say humans and robots have, even if you make robots that look like humans, they still have very different capabilities to humans.
Mm.
There's nothing at the moment that actually duplicates these things, our amazing hands.
Hands.
We have such amazing dexterity, so many sensors inbuilt in our hands that we're not even aware of that are really very difficult to replicate in robotics. So it always makes more sense for these technologies to be developed as ways to augment what people can do. And they've even done some research that shows that when you compare teams of humans versus teams of robots, but then also put teams of humans and robots in the mix, the human robot teams are the ones that perform best.
Mhm.
So I think, yeah, there's a whole range of areas where robotics can be used. The investment that we're seeing in humanoid robotics at the moment is going to open up a whole range of new possibilities. I would have always thought that it was a waste of time, actually, to invest in humanoid robots. It's actually a lot easier to just have a robot that, can navigate its way around on wheels, then go a lot further. A bipedal robot is actually quite a complicated beast. But given the amount of investment, it's really going to accelerate some of the opportunities. The whole reason for building humanoid robots is that you then don't have to necessarily change the environment to suit the robot. The robot can work more readily in environments where humans already are. Because at the moment, for example, if you look at an Amazon fulfillment center, they've designed those centers around the capabilities of the robots that they use in those centers. And humanoid robots kind of break that model open. But there's still a lot of challenges around, how those can be used. But I think the big benefit of that investment is that I think now you can probably buy a Unitree Go 1 robot in Australia for less than $20,000. Probably you won't be able to do much more than remote, but if you were prepared to pay a bit more, then you might be able to get some autonomous capability in the robot. But at that price point, what we're going to see is a lot more robots. And then that goes back to the whole, challenge that we face where people fear this technology. And a lot of that fear is based on never having had the opportunity to work with these things. Because I'd have to say, as someone who has worked in a robotics lab, it's very frustrating often to be working with robots. They can't walk upstairs, they can't open doors. You'd never ask one to try and get you a cup of tea. That would just
Or
end in
make a joke with.
right. And so I think a lot of the fear evaporates when people see that these things are not a one-to-one replacement for a human. And
Mm.
in fact, it's not until you put a robot in a work environment that people can then often go, oh, okay, well, it's not going to take my job, but look at these things that it could do that, maybe could supplement my job
Yeah.
or would make my job a bit easier. So in general, I think that's going to be a good thing. And hopefully, people can feel a bit more that they have control over, the direction that this
But
technology is moving.
mm. Now, you've also been a very powerful advocate for increasing the visibility of women and diversity in STEM. Why is this still such a critical frontier, and we're not seeing the diversity in this area?
Well, sadly, I'd have to say it's a cultural and structural issue that's going to be very hard to break down because in Australia, we have very gendered views of what occupations are suitable for men versus women. And we see this and it's modeled to our children from their first breaths. And it's very hard to, I guess, find interventions that will really rapidly turn the dial. So when I was a young scientist, when I looked ahead of me, there were very few female role models. I found it very off-putting. I think that, some of these programs that help to highlight some of the women who are role models in STEM are very important because, they often say you can't be what you can't see. But even so, even though there are more women than there were, it's still not changing at a fast enough pace for us to be looking at 50-50. So if you look at engineering departments around Australia, I think the numbers of women engineers is still stuck at about 15%, with some notable exceptions from a few universities that are really working very hard to change that. But, a lot of this goes back to the type of work that we associate with different genders and the pay that we remunerate people for these occupations. So a lot of people are unaware that there's a gender pay gap in children's pocket money. I don't know, did you know that?
No, I was just you probably look at my face. What do you mean there's a pay gap in children's pocket money?
And it's not because people deliberately give their boys more money than their sons more money than their daughters. What happens in most Australian households is that pocket money is often allocated according to chores, and there is more pocket money allocated to outdoor chores than to indoor chores. And we encourage our sons to go out and mow the lawn and do those outdoor activities, whereas we encourage daughters to do the more indoor work.
Empty the dishwasher and dust the house.
And then, so is it any surprise that, when they become adults, the son is encouraged to go off potentially to work in the mining industry, fly in, fly out, earn big dollars. The daughter might be encouraged to go in more into the caring professions like nursing, where although she might also be putting her life on the line, during COVID, and doing quite dangerous work in some respects, is paid far less.
Less.
We value those outdoor, let's say, blokey activities. We don't encourage our daughters to go into those fields, and we undervalue the caring for. And look, I think it has to go both ways. Not only, and sometimes I think encouraging women into STEM's not quite the way of looking at it. It's about making those occupations so they're attractive to women.
Yeah.
And equally, we need to be making the caring professions more attractive to men. And
Mm.
valuing it because, have you ever met a woman who said, oh, yeah, please don't pay me more money?
Yeah.
But, that's kind of the choice that we've left with. It's like, well, you either do these blokey occupations where you're not going to fit in and you're going to be made to feel like a square peg in a round hole. And yes, then you can earn more money. But if you do the sort of occupations that we've trained you from birth that you're more suited to, like caring, well, then you're only ever going to earn, two-thirds of the wage of, your brother who
Mm.
might be going into these, traditionally male occupations. It's very hard to break that down. And, you look at an industry like construction, which is really struggling to bring women in, and it kind of reinforces all of that. It's only men go into the hard hat, big boot type occupations, and that's something reinforced, as I said, right from children, and where we encourage them to do chores around the home and what occupations we see as acceptable.
I've got a young grandson who's only 10 months old. I'll be making sure he goes in and dusts the house and vacuums it more than mowing the lawns with his dad. Now that you've made that so clear to me. You helped bring the Grace Hopper celebration to Australia as well. What was the significance of that for you?
When I first moved into the robotics space, and as probably typically happens for many women, I found myself as the sole woman on the executive team, being the person responsible for improving diversity. So, in thinking about this, because I would say that in robotics, it's probably only 10% women. And in thinking about, well, how do you get the dial to change? Because my background's not in computer science and engineering. So I thought, okay, well, I'll ask some of the women who've managed to survive in this environment, and, just get a sense of, well, what's an important event for them? Like, what do they see as something that would be very supportive of women in the space? Because the last thing I wanted to do was recreate something that people, that already existed. And a lot of people mentioned to me about the Grace Hopper celebration, which is the largest gathering of women technologists in the world. And it's very hard to describe unless you've had the opportunity to go there. But a few people said to me, the Grace Hopper celebration does a great work in improving diversity. A lot of American companies go along to that event specifically to recruit for diversity. It's a very supportive environment. It's like a rock concert. It's like
Mm.
50,000 women technologists. Tickets sell out in minutes. I was fortunate enough to go to a Grace Hopper celebration in 2018, and yeah, it was truly remarkable. But the the challenge for women in this field in Australia is that it can be a once in a lifetime opportunity to get to the Grace Hopper celebration, because it's very difficult if you're outside the US. It's hard to get tickets, and often the only way that a woman in Australia would get the opportunity would be if they'd been fortunate enough as an undergraduate or student at a university to get one of the Anita B scholarships to attend. So I approached Anita B org, who run the celebration, about whether they'd consider having an event in Australia, so that we don't have to overcome these barriers of how you get to the States, how you get a ticket. And, after a lot of convincing and working with them, they agreed to hold one here. And it was small. It was, compared to the US, it was 700 women technologists attended that conference in Brisbane. There was very good support from corporates for the event. We would have liked to have made it much more Asia Pacific oriented, but we actually ended up with only a short lead time to put it together. And we, as much as possible, tried to follow the Anita B format for the event, which is quite different to the way a lot of conferences are run. But for many women, in fact, there were some women in tears at that celebration, because it was the first tech conference they had ever attended where they were not the minority.
Mm.
And there were quite a few brave men who were prepared to put themselves in the position of being in the minority. And that was, that was a different experience for them as well. Only tech conference where you have to queue up for the women's toilets.
Yeah. Yes.
We
You,
are,
you take over the men's toilet in those occasions.
That's right. Well, we're still in discussions with the Anita B org to try and bring that back, but obviously it's pretty tough times over in the US in terms of diversity. But if at all possible, we'd like to bring that back to Sydney.
Well, good luck with it. Hopefully
Thank
you
you.
can. It sounds like an amazing event.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to emerging female leaders in tech who both want to lead innovation and change the systems they're in at the moment?
Well, I guess two things. Pick your battles. You've only got so much energy. I mean, a lot of people talk about, microaggressions as, one of the key factors that lead women to moving out of some of these male-dominated environments. So you do have to be careful where you put your energy. But I would encourage any emerging women leaders to consider being role models themselves in whatever form makes sense for them. Because this was something I probably wrestled with a little bit myself. I thought, do I want to be a front person for encouraging women into what can often be hostile environments? I asked myself whether that was ethical. Because, if you're in these environments, then you know how tough they can be.
Mm.
And it's like, well, do I really want young women to be coming into these
Mm.
environments? But when I thought about it, I realized that at the rate that things are going to change, unless women are actually a little bit more forceful in demanding a seat at the table when these technologies that impact on all of us, not just men, are being created, then we're never going to see any change. In fact, I would encourage young women to be quite militant in their demands to have a say in how these technologies are being developed and created. And, I'd love nothing more than for more women to be going into this area, but they should go in with their eyes wide open.
Mm.
Having said that, I think that even in professions dominated by women, it's still not a level playing field. So, when I thought about it, I thought, well, is there any environment that is not in some way hostile to women?
I don't think there's any
Yeah.
environment that isn't hostile in some way, shape, or form. And I think there's a long way to go before that changes.
Yes, sadly.
Sue, have you experienced it yourself? I mean, you were one of the forefronts of, as you said, there weren't that many women ahead of you. So how did you, I guess, change that question a little bit? What did you face and how did you navigate it?
I guess it wasn't conscious. I think potentially I'm a bit stubborn, but also I'm probably not very socially apt. So, like, I've had experiences where, some women have come into the robotics lab where I worked and immediately, cottoned on to the fact that there were very few women and actually articulated that they felt uncomfortable.
Mm.
Whereas I guess for me, as I said, maybe not being very socially apt, like it's just like la 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 la. And until something really hit me in the face, I probably didn't notice. So,
Mm.
I mean, sadly, I think that often, in these male-dominated environments, some of the women who are successful maybe don't appreciate some of the challenges that women face moving into the environment because they survived, so they kind of think there's nothing special
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
But there is something special, and I don't have a social science background, so I shouldn't probably speculate. But I do think that sometimes women succeed in these environments by ignoring
Mm.
or pretending that it doesn't exist. I've heard so many senior women in technology get up and give talks about how they've never faced any discrimination. To which you kind of go,
Really?
exactly. But there is something powerful in that. If you don't admit that it happens, and if you refuse to see it, then I can see how you could probably that might help you push your way
Get
through
through
those
it.
boundaries. But
Mm.
it's completely unhelpful for new young women
Yeah.
coming through the system. So, yeah, how did like I said, I actually, or maybe I'm just a bit stupid, really, that I didn't cotton on to all of the cues that I was unwelcome. But certainly, there have been many slap in the face type moments where it's very clear. I've been told directly to my face several times that that I've only gotten a role because I'm a woman, which is, no one says that to men, although perhaps maybe they do in women-dominated professions. I'm not sure,
I
but
don't think that happens. I don't think even in female dominated professions that happens. We're giving you the job because you're a bloke. I don't know. I would hope not anyway.
well, and sadly, I meet a lot of young women who really get tied up on this whole merit
Mm.
argument. I don't want to get the job or I don't want to get this opportunity just because I'm a woman. And it's like, please wake up and smell the coffee because, your male colleagues have been getting these sort of opportunities since birth. You just haven't been kind of clicking onto that.
Mm.
Just because you've got this one opportunity and you think it's associated with your gender, like, would that hold your male colleague back? Not in a second. Why do we even
No.
have to ask ourselves these questions? That's probably the one thing I find very frustrating and sometimes hard to convince young women that accepting a women's scholarship, for example, they shouldn't even blink their eyes at doing it. But I mean, sadly, I think a lot of their male colleagues do make them feel very sensitive to that issue. I know a lot of women who have been, told similar things. Oh, you got that scholarship. Oh, I know why you got that internship. All insinuating that it's because of their gender. And so, really, the only advice that I have for young women is get used to it. People will always make those comments, and that they're not fair, they're not true, and you certainly haven't received as much advantage as your male colleagues. Um, just learn to live with it. You can't let it hold you back.
I want to switch a little bit back to the future of work. And I know that you've been quoted, which I love, that saying that the role of fun is so important in how we adopt to our evolving, very fast evolving landscape in business. What do you think is the most successful mindset leaders can cultivate to navigate this automation and AI and have fun along the way?
Oh, well, obviously being curious and allowing people the space to be curious is super important. But I also think kindness is one of those things that's very undervalued. And it was interesting, in the wash up of the last federal election, that was one of the first things mentioned. And being able to empathize with different points of view on technology is important because probably people have their reasons for being frightened of technology or not feeling comfortable with change. Being sensitive to what those are is critical to, I think, a successful implementation of technology. Yeah.
I wrote an article on LinkedIn around the ways that AI and robotics can help us with the climate crisis. Can you give us the key headlines that you think will become a reality in the future?
Well, I think, as we, particularly now that we've made a real commitment in Australia to move towards renewable energy, and a lot of these renewable energy facilities are going to be out in quite remote areas, is a huge opportunity for robotics and AI. You need to be able to use AI to optimize these facilities, and you will often need to use robots to do things like inspect the wind turbines, if at all possible, conduct on-site repairs, so you're not having to send people up into those dangerous areas. Trying to keep our electricity grid active is an ongoing challenge. We often are still using people in helicopters, which can be very dangerous, to do both inspections and maintenance of our power lines and towers. These are all areas where, as we evolve our robot technology, we'll hopefully be able to make happen seamlessly so that we can all enjoy the benefits of these technologies. We can be doing it in a sustainable manner that's not impacting on climate, and that doesn't put people in harm's way.
So we've come to the point in our podcast where we ask all of our guests our standard 4 questions. So the first one for you is, if you had to describe a future fit leader in just 3 words, the kind of leader we'll need in the years ahead, what would they be and why?
Yeah, I guess my 3 words would be curious, kind, and authentic.
And why those three: curious, kind, and authentic?
Well, curious because I think the pace of change means that you really have to be paying attention and, in some ways, have a fascination with that so that, you have an incentive to be well informed about what those changes are and how they might impact on the workforce. Kind, as I said, because I think empathy really is very key towards helping to make sure that these impacts are beneficial to the workforce rather than detrimental to the workforce. And authentic, because I think you can't really people are not going to respond to that empathy unless they get that sense that you mean what you say, and you will also do as you say.
Yeah, walk the talk as such.
Yeah.
What's one future shift coming the next few years that you think most leaders are underestimating or not prepared for?
If we're just talking about Australia, I think that Australia has been a little bit isolated since COVID, and that people don't realize the speed with which artificial intelligence and robotics is advancing in other countries. And so, we operate in a global environment. It's going to really impact on our competitiveness, particularly in the services sector where most of us are employed. And so I think, having that broad understanding of what trends are happening in different countries, where people are investing their funds, is really critical, because it may not be impacting on Australia in this particular moment, but it will definitely be impacting on us in the next 5 to 10 years.
And it's a space that we can play a real lead role in, from the conversation that we've just had today.
Well, I believe so, as long as, we create an environment where we're not continuing to lose our talent in these areas.
What do you wish more leaders were paying closer attention to?
Well, AI literacy, I think, is, and I guess more broadly, you could apply that to digital literacy. I don't think we've actually got digital literacy, under our belts, and now we're also having to face the challenge of helping people to understand AI and what it means. The two are very linked together. So I just think that any opportunities to give people tools to be able to understand how they can best make use of the technology, and so they can see it as exactly that, a tool, not a threat to their work, it is super important.
What are the possibilities or shifts you see in the future of leadership or work that genuinely excites you, and why?
Oh, I think it's I've always believed that there's no point in us investing a lot of time and energy into things like artificial intelligence unless it fulfills its promise. And the promise of artificial intelligence is that you will get truly personalized medicine and personalized healthcare. And when ChatGPT first came out, immediately I thought, hallelujah, both of my children have had different learning disabilities. And so they have found it hard to access educational content in the same way that, mainstream kids would. And obviously they're not the only ones, everything kind of just suits, the sort of middle group, and not the people on the edges. And AI is a way to overcome that. And that's what really excites me. I think, as the technology develops, and this is something we should demand of the technology, there's no point in us investing in these things unless it can fulfill its promise and really help us to, know what drugs are right for our bodies, assist us in education, so that, we can be given tools to learn, particularly for kids, so that they are not, left, I guess, behind, and so that they're given the same opportunities as everybody else to succeed. And I guess you extend that to adults as well, so that everyone gets that opportunity, and things are presented to them in a way that suits them as a person, not as part of a bigger group.
If you could embed one leadership quality into every current or future CEO, something that you believe will be essential in the next decade, what would it be and why?
Service, I think, maybe is a good term. I think sometimes in society we lose, because we're rewarded for our individual pursuits, we lose sight of what we need to be giving back. And I think the concept of service is very important. And I think, this would not be at all popular, but, the whole concept of, people spending time in the army, for example. So countries that actually have,
Service.
yeah, mandatory service. Not that I'm advocating that for Australia, but I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we all actually need to participate in civil society, and that we are an active part of any organization that we work for, or group that we're associated with, our government, all of those things. As an individual, we can have an important role in. And unless you take that service mentality into your leadership, then I think, unfortunately, what you're modeling is, I guess, a focus on the individual above the community. Whereas I think, we really need to be more focused on the community, because it is far easier to take on the challenges of these things, like these new technologies, if we do it as a community rather than if we just do it as individuals. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Complete sense. Sue, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast today and sharing your insights. It's a very interesting world that we're about to step into. And if you almost want to sort of, project out what the next 10, 20 years will look like. But I think there's a lot of change around the corner for all of us, whether it's in business, in health, in personal life. And I think it's a really exciting time.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Edna. Thanks for having me.
If you like what you've heard, please share, rate and review this podcast. And don't forget to share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of my social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting to your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space.